Thank you, Kitsap Sun, for hosting this and for putting it online so all the voters can see it. I'm Drew Hansen. I was appointed to the legislature late last year. And in my first legislative session, and my only session so far, I focused on jobs. We won 3 significant jobs victories in the legislature this year that I was directly involved in. We expanded the engineering program at Olympic College, trained more engineers for the shipyards. The House passed 3 of my jobs bills, 2 of which are now law. A bill that removes a tax barrier that was standing in the way to job creation through the Great Kitsap Forest and Bay Project, and a bill that helps the State Patrol train more firefighters. A third bill, a bill that would have given veterans the ability to register early for college courses, passed the House with unanimous bipartisan support, but it wasn't taken up in the Senate. And if I'm elected, I'll bring that back next year. We also passed the 2012 Jobs Now Act, which is a joint business labor proposal to take the state's 3 to 5 year list of construction projects we're going to do anyway, community college repairs, stormwater improvements, retrofits, do as many of them as we can now when construction unemployment is high and construction costs are low. You don't have great jobs without great schools. I have a son who just finished kindergarten in public schools, so this is something I care about quite deeply. We passed a budget that did not make any cuts to K-12 education this year, which is no small feat in an economy like this one. I'm a ferry commuter when the legislature is not in session, and I fought very hard for ferry funding to fund them as the marine highways that they are. We were able to maintain full service levels without any cuts for this biennium, and critically, we were able to fund a second 144-car ferry so that we don't have to cancel routes when boats go down for repairs. A lot of us live in Kitsap County because of the great quality of life, the clean air and water. And the Kitsap Forest and Bay project I mentioned earlier was being blocked by a tax that really had no business being there. When I was the sponsor of the bill that removed it, if this project does go forward, it's 7,000 acres of pristine waterfront and forest property, a potentially great tourism and recreation job creator. Former Commissioner Steve Bauer says this isn't a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, it's a once-and-forever opportunity. And I think he's right. I was very happy to be a part of moving that forward this year. So our jobs, our veterans, our schools, our quality of life, our ferries, those were my priorities last year. And if I'm elected, that's what I'll continue to support. Thanks so much for having us.
Jim. Incidentally, in the letter I said maybe I'll 3 minutes.
Oh, excuse me. We'll go ahead and do 3
So
minutes.
3?
3.
Okay, very good.
Isn't it rehearsed, you know, so.
My name is James Olson, and I want to be here to bill this important Norwegian battle, and that is the battle of the Sins, Larson, Olsen, and Hansen. So I know we're going to play well when it gets to our Norwegian friends over in Paulsbo and Browns, but anyway, off and running with the battle of the Sins. Again, James Olson. I ran for the 23rd Legislative District last time. My opponent, Ms. Chris Ralphes, taught me a lot about running a campaign, and I tasted defeat. But surprisingly, 4 months after I had tasted that defeat, Ms. Ralphes moved on to greener pastures and took a job in the Senate. I'd call your attention to a rather wry campaign YouTube. It's called the Democrat Donkey Party Game, and it kind of talks a little bit about what went on in that particular maneuver. I am a private businessman. I've been that for 40 years. I know what it is to live with regulation. I know what it is to have a budget. I know what it is. Actually, I know that the notion that the problem that I have is going to be solved by more government is flat out not correct. So as a private businessman, I know the difficulty that we face out there. Some people talk about they're for jobs, and I hear a lot of that coming from Olympia, how they want jobs. Many of them are government jobs or stimulus jobs, not necessarily long-term jobs. As part of my campaign, I've been to all the business areas and dropped that information there. Low budget, black and white, but it has the message out there to all the businesses in Kitsap, well, within the 23rd, Paulsbo, Kingston, Bremerton, Bainbridge Island. And the number of empty storefronts that I see is absolutely staggering. There's something seriously wrong. We can talk about jobs, but the spawning ground of real jobs is not from Olympia. And I'm not going to go to Olympia to say that it is. The spawning ground for real jobs comes from small businesses, businessmen that have the confidence that the business climate is friendly to them and they'll open up businesses. So, in addition to being a businessman, I also am a retired Coast Guard captain. In 06, I've had command of 5 or 6 units. I've had a Navy commissioned maritime warfare unit. I've done oil pollution. I was a law enforcement or federal law enforcement. I've done oil drills. I've commanded and I've been commanded. I know what vision is. I know what leadership is. I know what bad leadership is. I know no fear. Frequently wrong, but well, never wrong. Frequently right, but never wrong. Anyway, enough. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. I'm Honeybee Larson, and first off, thank you so much for having us here, as I personally feel that the conversation is lacking both substance and lacking honesty. The fact of the matter is, our state faces major budget shortfalls that are going to put at risk essential services vital to the well-being and the prosperity of our communities. And I believe the voters deserve an open and honest conversation about what the best way to deal with those budget shortfalls is, and an open and honest conversation about real structural problems in the way our state raises revenue. The fact of the matter is, we have the most regressive tax policy in the entire nation. Out of 50 states, we're 50th. If you're one of our poorest families, you're going to pay on average about 17.3% of your income in state taxes. If you're one of our wealthiest families, you're going to pay on average about 2.6%. Now, this is obviously a fairness issue, but more than just fairness, it's not sustainable. We have an outdated revenue system that's reliant on sales, property taxes, and excise taxes. We need to move away from this. We need to expand the revenue base to keep up with the modern economy. We have a structural problem which virtually guarantees budget shortfalls year after year. We have the Republican approach, which is to slash and burn everything, to the point where I feel like the majority of us are going to be left holding our hats out to the extremely wealthy begging for help. And we have the Democratic approach, admittedly my party, who is using a piecemeal approach to do what's politically easy, compounding the problem, nickel and diming the consumers instead of fixing structural problems. We can't just keep upping the sales tax. We can't just keep upping the gas tax, finding another product, a cigarette, a bottled alcohol, a candy bar. That's not going to fix the long-term problem. We all care about education. We all care about infrastructure. We all care about transportation. We need to start right now finding real, long-term ways to pay for these things. And I hope that's what I can do with my candidacy. And I'm happy to answer all your questions as we move forward.
Henning, let's start right on that, because I think that's something both of you would try to address as well. Offer some solutions. Are you talking about an income tax?
I absolutely 100% support an income tax. A lot of Democrats do support income tax, but they don't want to talk about it for the obvious reason. It's not popular, and it's not a good way to get votes. But I don't think that Washington's voters have had the opportunity to really look at the data, really look at the numbers, and have a real conversation about it. And I have faith that the Washington voters are going to change their mind on that issue.
We had a conversation about it once with the proposal that Bill Gates Sr. was behind.
Yes.
The tax on people making $250,000 and above. Is that the type of thing you're saying? You're saying something different?
I think that's part of it. I think I am a proponent of instituting some type of an income tax, probably because I'm concerned about the regressive nature of taxes on incomes probably over $200,000, somewhat of a graduated scale. But I think we also need to look at other forms of taxation as well, on income. As the modern economy is diversifying, we're finding our tax base shrinking. You know, this isn't the 1930s. It's no longer in Washington, how big is your farm and how many apples do you sell? People make lots of money off investment income, and it goes untouched. And while at the federal level, you've seen federal income taxes fall over the last 3 decades, and the majority of those tax giveaways, if you want to call them that, have gone to the top, the state has done nothing to recoup any of that back to put into our services here. And also I think we need the B&O tax, to me, is a major issue, because regressive taxes in our state aren't only affecting middle and lower income families, it affects small businesses, new businesses, expanding businesses, a business with a low profit margin. So I would like to see either a restructuring of the B&O tax or do away with it completely. And we can talk about what's the best way to do that, whether it's a corporate income tax or whether it's a value-added tax. But right now what we're doing isn't working, and it pretty much is guaranteeing failure to generate revenue in the future.
Okay. We'll go to Drew next, and I guess the question is two-part. First of all, do we have, as Henning is saying, a long-term problem with the way we raise revenues in this state? And then
what do we do about it?
Yeah.
We have a very significant structural problem with the way we fund the operation of our state. The state is 50% funded, the general fund is 50% funded by the sales tax. The sales tax is only on goods. It is not, with very few exceptions, on services. Another 20% or so is the property tax. Another 20% or so is the business and occupations tax, a tax on gross business receipts, which every business hates. The problem with this system is that it leaves you extremely vulnerable to recessions like this one when consumer spending falls off a cliff and construction falls off a cliff. This is a state that depends on consumer spending, and particularly construction spending, to keep itself afloat. With the system we have, we're not diversified in the sources of taxes that we collect, so you end up in situations like this one where you're just going up and down and up and down and up and down. So what do we do about it? Conceptually, there are two ways to go at the problem, and let me talk about what I think the barriers are to dealing with either of them right now. Way number one is you take the existing tax system as a baseline and you alter it. You take tax exemptions that don't generate benefit commensurate with their cost, you limit them or you eliminate them, you broaden the base of the existing tax system, and you lower the rates. That's option one. Option two is you throw away the existing tax system and you start from scratch. You do what Mr. Larson is talking about, an income tax. You do some sort of value-added tax, perhaps. You do a different type of business tax than the B&O tax. Wholesale structural reform. My view is a lot more sympathetic to option one than option two, just because it is a lot easier to build on something that you already have than to sweep everything apart. And I think we saw that when the Gates Commission effort, and God bless them, proposed very bold structural changes and really went nowhere. So, but here are there are two big problems standing in the way of following either path, option one or option two. First problem is public awareness. I don't think people really understand the extent to which we are a state that runs on the sales tax. This is the way we fund our state. And we take this money and we pay teachers. That's basically how the state operates. We have a sales tax on goods, we collect it, and we pay for education. That is a major public awareness problem that stands in the way of people having a grown-up conversation about taxes. I'm part of a group of first-year legislators who are going to spend some time in this intersession holding town hall meetings where we talk about what the tax system looks like, just so people know. That's the first problem. We have to build public awareness before we do either of these things. Second problem is Initiative 1053. For those of you who aren't familiar with this, Initiative 1053 requires a 2/3 majority vote in the legislature to raise taxes. That has been interpreted to mean a 2/3 majority vote to close tax loopholes. Think about that for a second. It takes 51 votes to put a tax loophole into the tax code and 66 votes to take it out. That's undemocratic. It's being challenged in court as an unconstitutional amendment. And King County Superior Court recently held that it was in fact unconstitutional. That decision's on appeal. It's going to be some time before it's resolved. But with Initiative 1053 in place, there is realistically nothing that can be done in the near term to fundamentally reform our tax system.
Jim, we'll go back to the structural question first, and then actually I was going to ask your the opinion on 1053 from each of you as well.
Where do you want to start?
I will let Jim give a chance as far as
But re-ask what the structural question is.
Well, first of all, whether you
because what's happened is Mr. Henning said something, Mr. Larson said something, and Mr. Hansen has said something, so it's sort of morphed along. So if you just rephrase it.
That's a pretty fair question.
Sure.
First question is whether you agree with what Mr. Larson said about having a long-term structural revenue problem in this state. Secondly, what would you do if you were in the place to do things differently?
Well, a good part of my last campaign was talking about the dire fiscal crisis we're in. So we just balanced the budget. We're still in a dire fiscal crisis. The problem really is not an issue. I'm not saying that money is aplenty, but it's how the money that we receive is being spent. Rather than the discussion about an income tax, which I think is flat out no, the voters have made that very clear. That's a non-starter, totally non-starter. Rather than saying it's a revenue side, really what Washington State faces is a serious spending problem. And the spending problem needs to be remedied. If it isn't, the state economist has said we're going to be facing these fiscal crises over and over and over again. And no amount of felonious budget gimmicks or smoke and mirrors calling a budget balanced is in fact going to solve the problem. Now my opponents, the two of them, well, their party, very much always look to the side of we need more revenue. It's very clear. The problem is there's not enough money. Well, there is enough money, but what we need to do is streamline to core state functions, fund those functions first, including education. Currently, the Democrats manage to come around to education when it's last, and there's no money, and we're in a super crisis, plus the courts have told us, knuckleheads, take care of the education issue. So we need to streamline. The state government is too large. I heard some cry from somebody from Olympia, probably the governor, about the cuts that she had to do. There were 900 cuts. Well, listen, I got out of third grade. The denominator is 140,000. That's not exactly a major hemorrhage of people, and probably most of them were positions that weren't filled. We have too many people. I've got a big heart, but the state is not an employment agency made to keep everybody there. We need privatization. We need to clean up the functions. So the revenue source, I think we can do with that. I think education has enough revenue source, but we have just too much government and too many functions. Case in point, $750,000. Dire fiscal crisis last session. The lady who was sitting to my right last time, Ms. Ralphus, she managed to bring home $750,000 to impoverish Bainbridge Island for the Bainbridge Island Art Museum. Go figure. How many of the 16,000 dire people, handicapped people, who were, thrown out, not literally, but figuratively, thrown off the rolls because there wasn't enough money, and someplace like Bainbridge has some pork brought back to it? That's the problem, not the revenue source. That's the predictable Democrat response. There's not enough money. There is enough money. It's how it's being spent.
And then quickly, whether you agree with the 2/3.
Absolutely, absolutely. The Democrats, Frank Chopp and Lisa Brown, who's retiring, goodbye, Lisa, I won't get to work with you. The main thing that they have a major bounty on is killing the 2/3 supermajority. They just hate that. Now, my opponent on my right was lamenting the fact that how it takes only a simple majority to put something in and to pass one part of it, but to put a new tax in takes 2/3. The voters have made that very clear. Tim Eyman, I believe it's 1089, that's out there. It will be an initiative. It will be there. It will be passed. The court, the Superior Court, could turn it down. It will go to the Supreme Court. The people have spoken. They want the 2/3. They don't trust government for good reason.
Do you agree with Mr. Hansen that the tax loopholes in this state need to be looked at?
Well, everything is up for looking at. But again, 2 years ago, I heard that a great deal, and we'll hear it on the campaign trail from Ms. Appleton. That's a familiar lament of hers about the fact of all the rich and the corporations that are just getting away with murder. That's really not the case. They need to look at it, but it's just simple. Reeling in the tax exemptions. We have to have a favorable business environment here. And by and large, the state doesn't. From the little people that I see as I drove around with the storefronts to the other companies that say, thank you, I'm going to Idaho.
Same question for you on.
Want to start with the 2/3 majority?
Correct.
Fundamentally, I do disagree with the 2/3 majority. Unlike Mr. Olson, I actually think the voters of Washington are not going to pass it this time. I've seen a lot more information out there in the last year or so. I've seen a lot more people getting involved. The Economic Opportunity Institute has been putting out a lot of research, and I'm pretty confident it's not going to pass this time. And I know it was found unconstitutional. I'm not confident that the Supreme Court will agree with that decision because in the past the state Supreme Court has upheld the 2/3 majority. But fundamentally I disagree with it. Along the lines of the tax loopholes, absolutely there are some we should take a look at. If there is a tax loophole that's not doing us any good, it's not creating jobs, it probably should be eliminated. Not all tax breaks are bad. We have tax deductions for being a small business on your B&O tax. We have some that do great to create jobs. But certainly, when we're creating tax loopholes at the rate of hundreds per session, it's probably something that needs to be looked at. And more than eliminating them, we need to have a better review process. If we're going to have tax exemptions, they need to come up for review every 5 years or so. And if the state legislature doesn't renew them, they should automatically sunset.
We'll start with Mr. Olson on this question, and it's something you guys just mentioned as far as public education goes. It was kind of a good year relatively. As far as the budget went, that they didn't suffer as many cuts as they had the year before, but there's also something coming before the voters about charter schools, and so I guess I wanted your opinion on whether, is that a good idea for this state? Has the time come for charter schools, and whether there's any other kind of innovations that you think Olympia should be looking at as we continue to look at the long-term future for public education in this state?
Mr. Olson first?
Okay.
In general, I realize the Washington Supreme Court has basically read the Riot Act to the state of Washington, having to do with how education is handled. In general, I think that that's really important. It's a shame the courts we've had to have the courts involved, and it's gone to this point. But in general, with education, I think the problem, once again, like the state, it's not a money problem. I believe education the education in the state of Washington has received increasing amounts of money over an extended period of time with diminishing returns. So there's something wrong with how the money is being spent. The state of Idaho can provide an education that performance-wise is just nearly indistinguishable from the state of Washington for 1/3 less. So it's not really money. So education needs to be reformed. Principals need to be empowered to make decisions. We need to have competition within the educational field, the public educational field. And that would be something like student grants that would attach to the student and allow students, well, actually the parents, to have their students avail themselves of other alternatives. And charter schools would be would be an excellent choice. I know that's going to come up before the voters here, and what did I hear? The WEA, there's a lawsuit. They're trying to stop it. So we'll see. Hopefully the voters will speak clearly on charter schools. So education needs to be reformed, and we need to do a variety of things of how money's spent. They can consolidate school districts. Schools need to have their budgets made transparent so people can see where the money is going. The WEA is a major impediment to the improvement of that. Now, I'm not going to get the endorsement of WEA. In fact, I completed their questionnaire, and they said, Mr. Olson, we don't even need to speak to you. I'm sure the check was being cut as they were talking to me, and it wasn't to me. I haven't yet to receive it, and I'm not going to receive it. So reform needs to happen. We have enough money in education. This past session, another game, if you will, that goes on in Olympia. And again, I want to make it clear, I'm a Republican. Olympia has been controlled in the House and the Senate and the governorship. That's going to change. That one's for sure. Mine is just straight vertical up from that, but that one is a lot more short. But the Democrats have controlled Olympia for a long, long time. It's time for positive change, not just change, but positive change. So, but one of the things that education, I'll just wrap up, David. One thing that the Democrats have done is they hold the education deliberations until every other Tom, Dick, and Harry program is funded. And then suddenly they come around to education and they go, my gosh, we don't have enough money. Well, of course you don't. That should have been taken care of first.
Well, I know you said it was a good year for education, but the fact of the matter is, over the last 3 years, the legislature has made a ton of cuts, like $10.5 billion worth of cuts. And we can't talk about education without talking about the budget, because the overwhelming majority of the budget is education. So when we hear people calling for more cuts, they're talking about cuts to education. The majority of the $10.5 billion we saw in the last 3 years in cuts came to education and higher education. That's not acceptable. And so you can't talk about education without talking about generating more revenue. It's just not possible. Charter schools, and when he says grants, I assume he means vouchers, which is paying for kids to go to private school out of public dollars. I don't agree with. What we need to be focused on is improving the public school system so that there is not a desire to go somewhere else. We're not going to amply fund education for every student in Washington with charters or with vouchers. It's going to be a small percentage of the population that are going to receive the benefits of this. And it's going to remove public oversight. That's not the solution. The solution is to fix the public education system and replace the funding that's been cut.
Let me go back a moment to address this generalized theme that the state has plenty of money, it's just not spending it correctly, and the state is just overspending willy-nilly. That is, of course, completely false. The state has cut about $11 billion out of the general fund budget over the last several biennia, as my colleague Mr. Larson just noted. State employee rolls are down. The Seattle Times reported we have about the same number of state employees now as we did in the late 1990s when the state had about 1 million fewer people. State employee pay is down. It was cut by 2%. That cut was raised to 3%. Teacher pay was cut by 1.9%. Teacher COLAs were suspended. State spending per capita right now is about where it was in the late 1980s. Personal income, the percentage of revenue that the state collects as a percentage of personal income has been going down. It used to be about 7%. It's now 5%. I mentioned these, even though it's a lot of facts and figures, just to say that this is a myth. The state has an extremely serious problem in the way it funds its operations. It is a structural revenue problem. It is not that there is lots of money that is just not being spent efficiently. Now, let me address this question about schools. I do not think right now charter schools are the answer. Here's why. First off, the research is very mixed. The large-scale study that Stanford did showed that some charter schools perform very well, the vast majority perform okay, and some perform terribly. In other words, it's a bell curve. It looks exactly like the results we get out of the public schools. That's the first point. So given that, why would we spend all this effort to replicate a system that in the aggregate performs as the public schools do? Isn't the better answer, point two, that we take the best practices from the highest performing charter schools and we use them in our public schools? Principal control over who's in the building, cultures of high expectations, tightly focused team teaching, hands-on curriculum. Do that first. And you know what? We're doing it. Go to West Hills STEM Academy right here in Bremerton. The new principal there, Lisa Heeman, a few years ago started building the groundwork to do a STEM, science, technology, engineering, and math, hands-on learning in a high poverty school, 78% poverty school, in partnership with engineers from the shipyard who come and work with the students, teach them to blow stuff up in the backyard. This is a fantastic school. Their test scores in science are up a lot. Their test scores in math are up a little, and we'll see what happens when the next round comes in August, but they have strong leadership, they have great teams, they have high expectations, they are going in the right direction. So that is part of the reform, to get to your question, that we're doing right now in the education system. And there's more than that. I mean, this year the legislature passed a major bill to change the way we evaluate teachers. So it's not just someone walks in, you get a 30-minute evaluation, you walk out, it gives you no useful information if you're a teacher for how you improve. Instead, we're going to have big, robust evaluations, multiple measurements of what teachers are doing in the classroom, multiple ways to figure out if students are actually learning, and we put some money behind it to train principals in how to do this. Because the foundation to great schools is great teachers. We're not going to get great teachers unless we figure out ways to evaluate them so that they can improve and all become world class. And let me just say one final point on the charter schools debate. I get, in my one term in the legislature, which was only late 2011, early 2012, I get 200 to 500 emails per day in my inbox. You want to know how many emails I've gotten from people in this district begging for charter schools? 0. Not one. No one. Everyone in this area. Thank you. I'd appreciate that. You'll break the record. What people in this area are focused on, as far as I can tell, is pulling together to improve the schools we have through West Hill STEM, through the Central Kitsap High School's honors program. I could go on and on about the great inventive things we're doing in the schools in this district. That's what people are focused on here. If people were focused differently, my view might change. If the research was different, my view might change. If we tried to roll out the best practices and they were blocked by collective bargaining agreements, my view might change. But that's not where we are. The collective bargaining agreements get renegotiated every 2 to 3 years. You can change them. In the interim, you can put in letters of understanding to put in whatever practices you want. That's how, for example, in Tacoma, they have the Lincoln Center School, which has extended school days, Saturday classes, all these best practices done in partnership with the union in that district. I think that's the direction we go in. You build on the innovations that are working now, you improve the existing system, and you fund it as the state's paramount duty.
Does anyone else have an education question? A lot of you guys that asked it too.
You're looking at me. I have questions because I'm very interested in early education. I'm talking about from birth to 5 before they go into public education. So I'd like to hear kind of your thoughts and feelings in that area. What do you value? What do you not value? What do you see as a possibility? Any thoughts?
Who would you like to go first?
Whatever gentleman wants to.
I'll start.
Okay.
I certainly, this is a big focus for me, both because we tend to talk about K through 12, and every piece of research I've ever looked at has said that before kindergarten and post-kindergarten are completely undervalued. So, and the major cuts we made to education have been on the bookends of K through 12. K through 12 did survive cuts this year, but early learning lost some money, and higher education has certainly been gutted over the last few years. So I definitely feel it's extremely important to put more resources into early learning and higher education. And on the higher education side, I want to say, right now, draconian budget cuts and rising tuition costs are putting college completely out of reach for the average Washington family. We've gone from it being about 6% of the median family income to pay for a university education to about 20% in the last 20 years. It's astronomical. I've been trying to put myself through college for 15 years now, and it's not easy. This has to be addressed, because if we're going to have the educated workforce, which is the key ingredient in a strong economy tomorrow, we have to get people educated today. Go ahead.
I'll come back to your question, which is very important. I just want to say something to Mr. Henning. Yes, college education is getting higher, but part of it's going, the cost curve on the inflation of higher education needs to be bent down. It's out of control. College has become like Club Med as far as what they're promising, what they're doing. It's really outrageous. And part of it ties in with funding, federal funding to the schools. That's where it goes. Labor costs, union costs at the institutions. Okay, enough of that. Early education is really important. Absolutely. I've had 4 children, and the early education they had was with their mother and was with me. That's really important. Everybody does not live in an ideal family. I'm not suggesting that I'm an ideal family. I'm just not even a representative family. But I'm a mom and a dad, and we've had 4 kids. But there's a great deal that our children learned prior to them showing up to kindergarten that had to do with them being front-loaded by 2 loving parents. I think that's really important to do. Now, if you have families that are either impoverished, or there's not a father there, or there's something seriously wrong, I think that that's important to not say to that child, because that child did not have an ideal arrangement, that person should be hamstrung and be lagging behind the performance of everybody else. But when I was a number of years ago, probably in the 80s, they had this like better baby nonsense. And it was like, if you take your baby and you play Beethoven to them in the womb, you're going to make them geniuses. That was like totally crazy. And the reason I mention that is children need stimulation, they need play, they need time to grow. And then they'll cycle into a school system that reaches some of the educational reform that I'm talking about with public charter schools and provisions made for that. But some of this becomes a form of daycare. It's when people are working, single moms and a young child at 3 can go off to a school program, That's a lot better than going to just a plain babysitting arrangement. But I'm not sure how that fits into the educational system, although it will help many children. I believe families should do it, and also I think churches can help out.
Mr. Hansen, do you mind if I respond to something he said?
By all means.
Before you start? I've heard this notion a lot, that early learning is a form of daycare, and I just have to say, I recently lived with a young couple who just had a second baby. They both work full-time, and their son, who is almost 4 now, was having problems reading, writing. He wasn't even speaking very well. And the doctors recommended a speech therapist that they couldn't afford. They got him into a preschool that they could afford, that many people might call a daycare, and now he's speaking better than I can.
Was it a public school or was it private?
I don't know the name of the school. I'd be happy to find out.
No, I guess what I mean, was it just on the economy, or was it something run by a school system and the taxpayers paid for?
Like I said, I'm not sure what school it was, and I'd be happy to find out for you. The point is that early learning is important, and it does work. And like Mr. Olson said, not every family is ideal. And I think it's talking down to early learning a little bit to call it a form of daycare. It's important, and it does great things for students. Sorry.
Mr. Hanning, I wasn't talking down to anybody.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So my kids are 6 and 3. My entire life is early learning, especially now that it's summer, when we don't have any paid professionals. The first line of defense, unquestionably, is the parents and the family life in those early years. We put our son in preschool when he was, I want to say he was 3. We started our daughter, she was 2. At that point, they're already talking, our daughter's flipping pages in books. It's amazing to see how much those little brains develop and how quickly they develop at those critical 0 to 3 years, where for most kids, you're not going to be in the public schools. If at all, you'll be in a private preschool. We sent our son to our church's preschool, Bethany Lutheran Church. We sent our daughter to a little one that's up by a church in Siebold. And so that's, that I think without question is the most important part of early learning, is the family environment you grow up in. And parents who should be reading to their kids, and who all of us should be reading with our kids and playing with our kids. Now, having said that, we need to do everything we can to make sure that when the public schools get young kids, we give them first-class educations from preschool, kindergarten on up. I'll just give you a quick example. The state of Washington is a leader in early learning. The Obama administration has these Race to the Top grants they give out for innovative practices for school systems nationwide. Our early learning system won one of those grants. We are very proud of that. We have an innovative, good, successful early learning system. But like everything else in the state, it's underfunded. I'll give you an example. We could have all-day kindergarten statewide that would be paid for. I was the co-sponsor of a bill that would have put about $60 million into all-day kindergarten. It would have paid for that by closing the sales tax exemption for sales to non-residents of Washington. You're from Idaho and you come to Washington, you buy something, you don't pay sales tax. That costs about $60 million between now and 2017. Now, it's a great thing. I love to give people tax breaks as much as we can, but with that $60 million, where's it better spent? Is it better spent giving tax breaks to people who don't live in the state, or is it better spent in all-day kindergarten for kids who do live in the state? That was my view. I was a co-sponsor of that bill. It got 51 votes because of Initiative 1053's two-thirds majority. It did not pass. I would love to see more of that if we could have some full funding along that model.
Go ahead.
Yeah, on that note, listening to your different opinions on where the schools are, ask all three of you, what legislation would you propose or support to fix the problems in the public school system as you see them now, including perhaps the CBAs or the role of the WEA in there? What are your opinions on how to fix the schools without talking about funding?
Why don't we start with Jim?
Okay. Excellent question. And I just to repeat somewhat what I said before, that there needs to be a serious systemic reform in how education is delivered. Frequently we hear at this table that the problem with education is a funding problem. It's not a funding problem. Well, there is a funding problem, but the reason there's a funding problem is because there's a spending problem. And the reason there's a spending problem is there's a vision problem, a vision of how the districts are organized, how principals are empowered or not empowered, what teachers are paid, what kind of evaluations go on. If it's the WEA has a pretty tight stranglehold as far as competition, and I do believe in competition. I do believe charter schools as public charter schools as competition to what's going on there. So reform needs to go on. We have probably too many school districts. There's too many, if you will, using a military metaphor, they're not foot soldiers, and there are too many generals sitting in the upper offices, in the upper echelons of the Office of Superintendent of Public Instruction, and the various superintendents, assistant superintendents, principals, vice principals, and things like that. We have two schools on Bainbridge Island that are basically co-located. They share a property line. Each has got a principal, a vice principal, a sergeant at arms, or whatever it's called, and all these things. Some of that could be worked together for an economy of scale. So, reform, economizing, charter schools, competition.
I think I asked for specific legislation or ideas that you have now. What would you propose if you were to attain the seat?
A specific legislation that I would propose? For the purposes of improving education or solving the problem with education.
As you see them.
I'm not even sure if this is something that would be kosher to pass this legislation, but a requirement that education as a budget item be the first thing out of the chute every session, period, not the last.
Yeah. Let me start by talking a little bit about the teacher evaluation bill we passed last session, because my answer is going to be to roll that out statewide. In the past several years, we've put together in 12, 13 pilot school districts a new way of evaluating teachers I described briefly earlier. This has been done collaboratively in partnership with the teachers, with the administration, with outside groups at the University of Washington who specialize in thinking creatively in how to evaluate teachers. And we are about to take the next steps to put this new teacher evaluation framework into action. The reason I think this is so important, do you think, how many of you, anyone see Moneyball? Who saw Moneyball? No one saw Moneyball. Okay, 3 people saw Moneyball. Moneyball is all about how we evaluate baseball players. The Moneyball problem is in baseball where you have actual quantitative metrics of success. I mean, you either hit or you don't. You either strike the guy out or you don't. For hundreds of years, it turns out we didn't know anything about how to evaluate baseball players. That's what Billy Beane figured out with the Oakland A's in the 1990s. If that's where we were evaluating baseball players, think about how much farther behind we are in how to evaluate teachers, where there are not easy quantitative metrics of success or failure, where you don't know if the kid's learning because you're a great teacher, or because the kid had a good breakfast, or because the teacher in the next classroom over is reinforcing what you say. Until we figure out how to make teachers move from okay to good and good to great, I don't think there's a lot we can do in the education field that's going to be nearly as important. That is the foundation, in my view, to all further reform, is figuring out evaluations that actually help teachers improve. So that would be my specific piece of legislation. We see what happens in this next year with our intended rollout. We then expand it statewide and build on whatever we have learned from this experiment to continue moving this forward. The reason I wouldn't go beyond that, though, is I'm not a teacher. Everyone thinks they're an expert in how schools should be run. Everybody's been to school, so everybody says, boy, I know what schools should do. You should do this, 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 and this. That is preposterous. I have no practical idea what to do with a room full of 30 kids, 4 of whom have special needs, 10 of whom haven't eaten. I mean, I don't know how to do that. And as a result, most of the hard questions about school governance, how do we educate people differently in the schools, are properly addressed at the district level. in my view, all these, like the West Hill STEM Academy, that didn't get put together because the legislature said, gosh, we should have a STEM Academy. That got put together because the district leadership worked in partnership with teachers to create a new, innovative, and cool model that's really working. That's my view for how reform should happen.
I think one of the best things you could probably do at the state level to help students is address curriculum and standards and possibly opening up different tracks for students. I can tell you I've spoken to a lot of young people who feel like they're doing things that are busy work or not what they want to be focused on, what they want to go to college for. There's a lot of school districts which are experimenting with having different types of standards for graduation if you're going to be an engineer or if you want to be a writer or a history major. So making it actually easier for students to navigate the system to get to their goals so they can get to the eventual goal, which is having a career, I think is extremely important. I also think we live in Kitsap County, so if you want to go to college here, there's a huge investment on the part of the family to move or to pay for travel costs, to take the ferry to UW every day, or to relocate. We can eliminate some of these costs and open up more four-year degree options at a place like OC. Washington has some of the best community colleges in the country, and I think we need to be utilizing them more for four-year degrees. It's going to become a lower cost option for kids to go to college. So that's something that I would like to work on at the legislative level at the state.
Larry's going to ask a question, then I have one more, and we'll try to wrap up all of them.
I'd like to go back real quickly.
Okay.
Go back to taxes. When I talk to my friends about taxes and tax reform, invariably it goes along the lines of, well, if we went just to income tax and got rid of sales tax, before, even my more wealthy friends would be all for it. The next thing they say, yeah, but once you do that, then later on they're going to impose a sales tax after we have the income and end up with both and so forth and so on. So I'm kind of curious how you all feel about that. Maybe start with Mr. Hansen. I'm also curious if you want to do a huge reform, like going from sales to income tax only, with a supermajority, is that even realistic in our state?
Yeah, no, I think I told you my view maybe in a bit more long-winded fashion than I should have earlier. Of the two conceptual ways to address the tax system, number one, take what we have now, reduce or eliminate loopholes that don't produce benefits commensurate with their costs, broaden the base, lower the rates. Number two, throw it all out, new system, income tax, business profit tax, whatever. I vote for number one. I think number one is the only one that has a realistic chance of moving forward. Having said that, 1053 prevents us from moving forward on anything right now. I mean, the bill I just mentioned to close the non-resident sales tax exemption to fund all-day kindergarten, great bill. Majority of the legislature supports it. Would have put $60 million in all-day kindergarten. Doesn't pass. If you can't do reform that is that micro, what's the likelihood you're going to get large-scale structural tax reform in the current with these supermajority requirements?
Well, your anecdotal remembrance of what your friends not believing, as they whisper in your ear, will give you the income tax, but will take away the sales tax. No, and that's why the Bill Gates proposal that it was just going to be the upper income people that were going to get the income tax. Now, I did an awful lot of doorbelling in the 23rd Legislative District, and I don't care if these people were rich or poor, and most of them were not rich. They did not support the income tax. They didn't trust government for 1 second that it was going to be just for the rich. And certainly if they had promised it's going to be just the income tax, even for the rich, and nothing, and we'll get rid of the sales tax, that's not going to happen unless there's a constitutional amendment doing that. So, I am not for just some wild experimentation for just the sheer joy of it, to throw out the sales tax and try an income tax. No, I think what we need to do is keep the income tax, clean up some of the B&O tax, some of the insurance reform, some of the other reform having to do with unemployment insurance, and driving the workforce down to core emissions is what we need to do, not a big experiment on bringing in an income tax.
Well, as opposed to Mr. Hansen, I do feel we need major structural change to the tax system. I don't think we should eliminate the sales tax. I think the more regressive taxes should be lowered substantially on the state level and let the communities and the municipalities use more of the sales tax revenue or property tax revenue. The key, though, is to diversify the revenue. So we're not so dependent on one source, so that when that sector gets hit, we're all in serious trouble. So I wouldn't do away with the sales tax, and I don't think that's a good idea. And I wouldn't bring in a huge income tax. I think there needs to be a balanced approach. He mentioned something about the voters don't trust government. And I agree. And I think this is one of the biggest problems we face, is voters don't trust government. But I don't think it's because government is trying to take everybody's money anymore. I think voters have overwhelmingly, in the past few decades, shown they're willing to pay more taxes if they think the money is going towards a good cause. They vote higher property taxes on themselves all the time, higher sales taxes. The problem is that they're not seeing any results, because even though they keep raising their own taxes, these types of taxes, the structural problems keep it from keeping up with the growth and the more and more demand of social services. So of course they're unhappy. They keep saying we're paying more and more, but we're not seeing any change. We need a complete and total structural change. Mr. Hansen said we should try to just alter the system we have. That might be easier, but just because it's easier doesn't mean it's the right thing to do. It's going to be hard, the 2/3 majority, but somebody has to start having this conversation now. We need to start making these changes now. We go get our oil change for $30. We don't want to pay $30, but we do it because down the road, the car trouble is going to cost $3,000. We need to make changes now before it gets worse.
Okay, and Ron, you had a question?
Just a real couple of quick ones here. For Mr. Larson first,
Yeah.
You know, looking in your website, hearing you today, we talked about taxes and education.
Sure.
I know nothing about your background,
Sure.
your work experience. You know, who are you? I don't know.
That's a good point. I am, I guess, you know, what you would call an average citizen of the district. I spent the majority of my life here in North Kitsap. My family moved here right before I started the 8th grade. So I graduated from the North Kitsap School District. My family were commuters. My stepdad worked for Puget Power, then Puget Sound Energy. My mom worked for Marriott and then Urest. They both worked in the Bothell area. So in the summers, I started commuting with my mom. That's, you know, one of my first jobs. And we started commuting in the summer together, and I kept doing that for a while after high school. I moved to Seattle to go to Cornish College of the Arts. That's the first time I lived in the city. Then I realized I was paying about $20,000 a year to get a theater degree, and that probably wasn't going to get me anywhere, so I only spent 2 years there. I came back. I've been working for the Palms Drive and Clearwater Casino for about 8 years now. So I've had a chance to speak with a ton of people from the district through that job, obviously. I don't have any elective experience. I'm just somebody who's been passionate about politics. What I've been trying to work my degree towards is poli-sci and economics. And even if I get elected, I hope to actually finish that one of these days. It's certainly a personal goal for me. But, yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Well, what do you do for the tribe, just out of curiosity?
I operate as their poker tournament director, and I work in the poker room. Yeah.
Can we give each of these guys just, since everyone hasn't heard from them, maybe just very briefly in a minute, kind of a bit about your background?
Yeah.
Just out of fairness? So
Sure. No, sure. And I realize that was just directed to Mr. Henning. Businessman, 30 years, family business, real estate, Kitsap County and King County. It's been tough. A couple of my beliefs as far as business: if it's not broken, don't fix it. More government isn't going to make my job any easier. You've got to work really hard out there to customer focus. So, businessman. I've had the Coast Guard experience, leadership. One thing that I had, and I'll make this, wow, this is really the elevator talk. This is like one floor. That had to do with streamlining. I was the project officer for the commandant, and he had project officers all over the country, where the Coast Guard was told, as far as the GIPRA, having to do with Al Gore, government, get smaller, faster, core missions, get rid of extra space. I was the man. We called ourselves the Happy Grim Reapers. And actually, we were pretty happy and not really Grim Reapers. But the federal government, the Coast Guard in particular, got rid of 2.5 floors of AAA space in the federal office building. They took a lot of their functions, sent them out there. Some of the functions they did that they didn't need to do, they didn't need to do. I mean, they still had the fire station, and they went out and saved people. But I did that, and I got to see that government can get smaller and smarter and do more with less. Now, I realize you can only beat the horse so much, where eventually you just can't get miracles out of it by shrinking it. But I do believe the good folks in Olympia can handle some of that going on, and that's not going to be easy. They're not going to take kindly to it. Even my own party's not going to take kindly to it.
Just a couple
Sure.
points.
I'll just talk about my background. I was born in Wisconsin. My dad grew up on a dairy farm. He was the first one in his family to Yeah, I noticed that. Nice to meet you. Fellow dairy farmer here. He was the first one in his family to go to college, first one in his family to go to law school. He met my mom at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. She's from Seattle. Her mom taught at Bailey Gatzert in Seattle. Her dad was a civil engineer with the Navy, and then an engineer in the Army Corps for a while. My dad pretty quickly figured out that Seattle was a nicer place to live than Wisconsin, although with worse football teams. And so picked up the family and moved out here when I was a kid. I went to public schools at this state, K through 12, and moved to Bainbridge Island 8 years ago. Lived there with my wife and our 2 kids. We're real active in Bethany Lutheran Church, the church we go to. And before I was on the legislature, I was on the state's Economic Development Board, the Community Economic Revitalization Board, the CURB Board. The governor appointed me to that to represent the public. And I was on the Olympic College Foundation Board for a number of years, most recently on the Scholarship Committee, where you get to read dozens of essays from students from kids around the district who $300 from the foundation is the difference between pursuing their dreams of becoming a nurse or working at Applebee's. I mean, it's a sobering experience. So that's something about me.
Being a Yale law student, did you finish law school?
I did. I finished. Yeah.
An attorney.
And I'm a practicing lawyer. I'm with a firm we have an office in Seattle. I'm a partner there. We represent plaintiffs, defendants, do all sorts of civil litigation. So that's what I do in the off season when the legislature's not in session.
Can I ask one more question?
Why don't we have one last question from you?
It's something that I'm always interested in here. I heard the term pork used once here, but pork is often somebody else's need. So I'll throw the question out to each one of you. In this era of austerity, how are you going to balance the needs of your constituents who have their hands out for help with the need to cut funding? Where is your priority?
Obviously, I talk a lot about raising new revenue, but I'm not going to be ignorant to the fact that if I'm going to be a legislator and ask you to pay taxes to the government, then you have to spend it wisely. And so when we are facing fiscal difficulties, we can always make things more efficient. We can always find things to cut. I do think we can't just go in with an axe and start hacking in the name of balancing the budget. There's a great resource for the legislature, the Washington State Institute for Public Policy. This is a research arm for the legislature. All they do is bipartisan research to find out how programs work, if they're cost effective, if we're getting the results we want. Right now they're doing a big project looking at all sorts of aspects and all sorts of programs in Washington about evidence-based programs and results. Now, if I'm going to be a legislature, that's the direction I'm going to go. What is working? Is there programs that we might have passed with all the best intentions, but we're not getting the results we'd hoped for? Then yeah, get rid of it. Try something else. I mean, if we're going to cut, and we are going to have to make cuts probably, I think we should at least approach it from a standpoint of, first off, is there things that aren't working? Are we not getting the results, the bang for the buck that we wanted? So that's where I would go with it.
Are you willing to cut those things that affect your district?
I'm willing to cut things that affect my district if they are not working correctly, if they're not giving us the results they want, if I don't feel like they are worth the cost. I'm certainly, you have to balance. There might be a few people back home in the district who hate it, but I'm not going to make my decisions based on the next election. If it's not working for the state the way we hoped it will, then it's gone in my vote.
How do you judge worth the cost?
Well, like I said, I would rely heavily on these people whose sole objective is to research these things. Is it meeting the goals that were set out when you created the program? I would like to see the Washington State Institute for Public Policy expanded to do it. I mean, this is such a huge asset to any legislature. We have other states that are coming in trying to copy the model. So.
Okay, since I was the offending person to use the word pork, I stand by the example that I gave, $700,000 for a very wealthy island to receive for an art museum. I mean, Bainbridge is well heeled. So, but to your question, it wasn't just about that, but that's I wanted to make clear that I do consider that to be pork. So how to handle the constituents' needs and the hands that they have out, and needy hands that they have out, and what to do about that. Well, the dire fiscal crisis that Washington State faces is going to need some strong medicine. I don't mean to, I'm not going to single out the 23rd for undue harm, but we have to have sort of, it's not just a balkanization of all the different legislative districts. Who's got more suck gets the money, in which case we probably lose to Pierce and King County and the legislative districts they have over there. That's not the case. I hold to the admonition that a rising tide raises all boats. Washington State needs to create the reform that I talked about in education as well as structure and create a favorable business environment. And I'm confident that with that, untold benefits will come to all those hundreds, if not thousands, of empty storefronts and people waiting to start businesses here. And the answer is not government to make the jobs, it's for the private sector to make the jobs. So, and what Mr. Henning was just talking about, how, what David, what you asked about, how do you tell if something is worth the bang for the buck? Well, there's something called performance audits. And performance audits are a great way, resisted by some, certain parties, but anyway, but they're now sort of the law of the land and accepted to go into various agencies and take a look at programs and funding and find out if in fact those they're doing what they're being paid to do, or should they even be doing what they're doing, whether they're being paid to do or not. So it's that kind of reality check that we need to do, and it's no good to ask the legislators. I agree with Mr. Hansen that he can't be an education expert. I can't either. I would trust the performance evaluators to look at that fairly, kind of like the CBO to do an analysis.
If I understood your question correctly, when people think of PORC, they usually think of capital projects in a district, like you build something new, you get some new thing that's actually being built. My answer to your question of how would you balance austerity with what the district asks for is if it doesn't meet an actual need in the district, a transportation need, an infrastructure need, I'm just not going to advocate for it. And here we need to get into a somewhat technical discussion of how the budgeting process works. The state has 3 budgets. There's the operating budget, which is what we spend all our time talking about today, funded by sales tax, basically pays for schools. There's the capital budget, which funds much of projects that go in individual districts, community college repairs, stormwater improvements, energy retrofits. That's funded part by fee money and part by bond money. Third is the transportation budget. That funds the ferries and the highways. That is basically funded by the gas tax and a number of other transportation-related fees. The sorts of projects you're talking about don't live in the operating budget. They live in the capital budget and the transportation budget. There are any number of requests that come in from the community for different things to go in these packages. And I advocate for the ones that I actually think meet actual needs. I'll give you a real practical example since I just lived it. We got $750,000 in the transportation budget for planning for improvements at the Suquamish Way 305 intersection, where I just spent about 15 minutes clogged up at the Agate Pass Bridge, right by where Mr. Larson works. That is one of our well-known bottlenecks in the county. We have got to do something about that bottleneck. That is a perfectly appropriate use of state transportation money. It's going to make people able to move faster around this area, get to their jobs quicker, get home to their families quicker. That's fair. If it doesn't actually add value in that way, then it's not something that I'm going to go to bat for.
Guys, I appreciate your time today. I could keep asking questions, but we want to be respectful of the hour and respectful of these members. This isn't the only chance we'll have because we're going to have.
I think we all have a lot more to say.
I know. I always.
That's what the campaign's called.
Yeah. Our website, elections.kitsapsun.com, is where this video will be posted, and also you're going to get an email that encourages you to fill out some biographical information and also answer some further questions. And we're going to kind of maybe generate a few that we didn't get to ask here. So you will get a chance to write some of that, and we'll share it with the voters and publish those in the paper as well. So hopefully we're playing our role there, and we appreciate you playing yours. With that, thanks for coming.
Thank you. Great. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Mr. Editor.